Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. For years my older sister's bio dad died in an accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident, it was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30-some years and my sister deals with a fuckload of mental issues and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think Moda Norman Rockwell style all-out meal, but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a shitty teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head, and absolutely screams, "Yeah. Your fucking child molester dad blew his fucking head off. He never had to deal with your bullshit." And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. That story sure was a wild ride. I hope your sister got some help. And her kids. My dad secretly had a vasectomy after I was born, after my mom lying to him about taking birth control resulted in my birth. Our family is great at communication and conflict resolution. The great question here is if you have any siblings. I was number 4. He knew she was cheating when she got pregnant with number 5. I'm in a similar but very different boat. I'm number 5, my dad got the snip after number 4. I'm 100% my dad's son. Snip didn't take. My great-aunt's husband killed his first wife, then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico and he fled to NYC so my great-uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Isn't it scary how succinct the explanation of things like this can be? My dad's first cousin is serial killer Kenneth McDuff. We saw the America's Most Wanted episode when it aired and were so surprised to hear about a McDuff, not knowing he was a relative. Kenneth Allen McDuff, March 21, 1946 to November 17, 1998, was an American serial killer. He was convicted in 1966 of murdering 16-year-old Edna Sullivan, her boyfriend, 17-year-old Robert Brand, and Brand's cousin, 15-year-old Mark Dunham, who was visiting from California. They were all strangers whom McDuff abducted after noticing Sullivan. McDuff repeatedly raped her before breaking her neck with a broomstick. McDuff was given 3 death sentences that were reduced to life imprisonment consequently to the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court ruling Furman v. Georgia. He was paroled in 1989 and went on to kill again. He was executed in 1998 and is suspected to have been responsible for many other killings. McDuff was given 3 death sentences that were reduced to life imprisonment consequently to the 1972 U.S. Supreme Court ruling Furman v. Georgia. He was paroled in 1989 and went on to kill again. He was executed in 1998 and is suspected to have been responsible for many other killings. Jesus H. Christ, they fucking paroled him after he had been given 3 death sentences commuted to a life sentence. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. Shame too, you might have been able to launch one of the most successful podcasts of all time if you had. Porn my dad wrote, JFC, the opening writes itself. I always thought my 2 older brothers got addicted to drugs because of their own decisions and the people they hung out with. It turns out that my dad had been feeding them pills since they were about 10 to shut them up. Years I held resentment against them for not being good older brothers like they should have, only to find out that it was my father who I had praised all those years that was truly evil. Wow, that really is dark. How are your brothers doing now? WHY the neighbors moved, trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them, their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill, the cops came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered whatever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home, they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home, they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep, the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them, as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. Quick thinking by those parents made a workable lie up on the spot. That babysitter's a hero too. I'm super glad the kids were safe, but I can't stop thinking about that poor terrified 14-year-old child saving those kids before she died horribly. That was someone else's child. Karen Slattery was her name, according to ARP's article. Wow. Was the killer ever found? Yeah. I just went and plugged the facts I knew into Google. The killer was found, and eventually executed, quite recently it seems, for his crimes. CNN.com/2023/06/16/1/Florida-executes-inmate/index. That my biological mother used to give me heroin and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share, so I'd go through withdrawals, but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. Jesus, I hope you're doing okay now. Thank God, yes. Very well and healthy, and successful in my happy way. My uncle molested my mom. I don't understand how he is still welcome in the family. Familial sexual abuse is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. He's a good man who made some bad choices, and nobody is perfect, and God forgives those who pray, my family. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America, and why? For one of my great-grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there. And for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with World War I right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. This makes me wonder how many of those projects are basically lies. I bet many parents don't want their kids saying some shit like, well, after my grandma's sister was beheaded, they decided to pack up and come here. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the Union, but it wasn't till after he died that I found out just how much of a Union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer, she lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. Poor woman. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Her daughters both liked to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Here's a dark secret I am keeping myself. My late FIL pretty much did this to himself. My partner knows FIL stopped doing his prescribed walking and ate lots of fast food after MIL died. That was too obvious to hide, since we went to live with him for a while. What I kept to myself were the multiple unopened bottles of Xarelto I found when we were clearing out that house. Also another one I've forgotten the name of. Presumably, he kept refilling the scripts so his doctor wouldn't catch on. But then he chucked them in a drawer and only took them when we came to visit. He died emotionally when Mil passed on. They'd been genuinely devoted to each other and she was his world. It took 16 months for his body to catch up. He had a massive stroke and died a day or so later. I can see worse ways to go than being stuffed full of salty and buttery deliciousness. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise! Took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later, my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had the life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day Uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird, so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty fucked up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16, but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now, and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck. Never thinking something like that would get him killed. Growing up, I always knew my parents had marital issues, constant fighting, a couple times dad disappeared for a few days living in his car, issues with drinking. But they stayed together, and when I asked why didn't they divorce, they always said they loved each other too much. And in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents in fact are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they've done to each other in front of me. What I've managed to put together is: my parents met when they were 14 and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went on to university after college, we're UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties, while my mum was studying, that he cheated on my mum with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumps him. Barely a year later, my dad realizes he doesn't know how to do anything for himself, no one else wants him, and he goes crawling back to my mum. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her, not immediately but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, aged 22 now, she's already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it frankly, were in Paris, but forgot the ring, and proposed back in the hotel room after they'd visited the Eiffel Tower that day, which was her dream proposal, but she says yes. A month after, their married mum pressures him into having a child that he doesn't want, and 9 months later I was born. They soon realize how hard having a child is, and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me, there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she didn't abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he wouldn't have to raise them. He didn't, but neither did she. Frankly, I did. And that is only what happened before, shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we'd be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married, and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her time and time again. Our parents' generation is screwed up. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. Kidnapped and then they didn't want him back, what the hell? Excuse me for asking, but was the kidnapping legit or was it set up to get rid of him? This is so sad. My aunt was a real piece of work. To backtrack a moment, this side of my family isn't biological. Technically my dad is my stepdad, but he raised me from toddlerhood and he's my dad, pure and simple. All of his family treated me as one of their own. Except my aunt. She would always tell my grandparents that she just couldn't understand how they could love me because I wasn't blood family. I have no idea why she didn't want her son back. It was a familial kidnapping, non-custodial father. When my cousin was returned, she ditched him with my grandparents and got back together with her other half. When I was a teenager, my grandma called my dad, crying. My aunt was doing some digging and discovered she and my dad were adopted. I'm not defending this, but it was the 1950s and in another country. Not disclosing an adoption wasn't unusual at the time. My aunt threatened to tell my dad, so my grandma called and said they were adopted. My dad's reaction was literally, "So?" My aunt never spoke to my grandparents again, and my cousin turned out exactly like her. And so, all those years of not liking me because I'm not blood backfired, because she isn't blood either. I'm glad that has never mattered to me. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss, and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. I was waiting for so we buried that drifter in the back 40 and planted a tree above his grave. I don't know about dark, but here goes. My great-grandfather murdered the mayor of the village he lived in. Why? Because the mayor was sleeping with his mom while his father worked on the field. I think he was 15 or 16 when he did that. I don't know about dark. Proceeds to tell story about infidelity and murder. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why Mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. When I was very young, my family lived in a townhouse, and against all local bylaws, my mother decided to keep a horse in our backyard. Not only that, but it was an ex-racehorse that came as a package deal, the goat companion that slept in the closet of my nursery. I also later found out she was running a grow-op in the basement. This is so nice to read after all the other entries about child rape and murder. Great-grandma died from a botched abortion when she got pregnant a 7th time. Finally I got one. From when I was aged 6 to 13, my mom dated a fellow named Murray. We all lived together in an old farmhouse. Murray was a wonderful father figure to us, but he also had a drinking and driving problem, and after a particularly nasty accident, Mom waited until he came home from the hospital and was well enough to take care of himself before leaving. The whole time we lived there, my sister and I never went down into the basement, as it was infested with spiders. I always thought it was because of the drinking and driving she left him, but as it turns out that was only part of it. The other being that he had a massive grow-op for weed in the basement. Mom stated had the police found out about this, she would have lost custody of us. Murray has long since passed, but he would have had a giggle that weed is legal here now. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was flawed. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3 to 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. Your stories are wild. Mine is super tame. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist. Poor Aunt Gloria just wants to be a nude lady and everyone acts like she's a leper." My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. My uncle raped his own younger sister for years and nothing was really done about it. How awful. He was violently murdered in 2001 and nothing of value was lost.